Have you ever wondered what it's like to work in the green energy industry as a scientist or as an engineer? Or maybe you would like to work in the green energy industry, but you're not really sure in what kind of function or what kind of topic to work on or which kind of company to choose. Then this video is exactly for you. I'm Simon. I worked in the green energy industry for the last 2 years, and prior to that, actually also as a consultant consulting green energy companies. And I want to share with you my view on the industry itself, what it's like working there, what also the chances and potentially also the challenges are, and which niche or which topics could be interesting for a young engineer or scientist. Let's take a look at what the green energy industry actually entails so we can get a better understanding of what it would be like to work there, what kind of sectors there are, what kind of business models there are. Right? So what I show here is the value chain of the green energy sector, and that's just my personal view on it, but I think it helps to really describe what kind of opportunities there are in that sector. So on the left-hand side, you start with the renewable energy generation. So that's wind projects, solar projects, or any other kind of other renewable energy like hydropower, right? And with that, you generate renewable electricity. That renewable electricity needs to be stored somehow, right? Because it's intermittent. So then you have, as a next step in that value chain, electrical energy storage. And that can be classical lithium-ion batteries or other battery types like flow batteries, but also, for example, thermal energy storage like molten salt batteries. For example, last year I've visited a very large molten salt battery in Morocco where they use solar energy to heat up a molten salt and then run a steam turbine. Right? So here you can imagine any form of energy storage that is not molecular. Then in the third step, if you want to transport your energy over a long distance or store it over a long duration, you look at power to X, so conversion of your electricity into some form of energy carrier, chemically usually. So that can be in a very common and prominent form hydrogen. So you use an electrolyzer to generate hydrogen from water and electricity. And then you can even go a step further because hydrogen itself is very difficult to transport and to store and can convert that molecule to carrier molecules like green methanol or green ammonia or green natural gas or any other fuel or molecule that you can imagine. And in that molecule, you can essentially then store the energy, you can transport it a lot easier than in hydrogen or even electricity. The next step, we just mentioned it, is then of course also the transport and the storage of those energy carriers. And for example, for hydrogen, there's a lot of research going on how to most effectively store it, for example, in metal hydrides or in organic carriers, but also new vessel types or materials. So there's a sector also that deals with the storage of hydrogen and also other energy carriers that I just mentioned before. And the last segment is then the end use of that renewable molecule, right? So that can be, for example, in the transport sectors. If you generated a renewable methanol or ammonia or natural gas, you can use it for shipping or for trucks, or also in fuel cells for data centers, potentially even for cars. So there's a lot of end use cases. You can even use hydrogen or any other carrier as a direct feedstock in the chemical industry. So any end use case that's typically targeted at decarbonization is then able to use those green fuels or those green molecules, right? So now we have a bit of an overview over the overall green energy sector. And if we look at where we are standing today, I would say we're somewhere here, right? Why? Because obviously there are already existing renewable energy projects, large wind and solar power plants, and they've come quite far down the price curve. So I would consider that to be rather established technology. And similarly for electrical energy storage, I would say it's a little bit less mature than renewable energy generation, but still today we have existing operating plants that can store a large amount of energy. And I'm talking about hundreds of megawatt hours, or potentially even into the gigawatt hour range. For example, that molten salt power plant I mentioned in Morocco, but also lithium-ion batteries that are getting installed in larger and larger scale today. Where we are transitioning into now is to also have large-scale hydrogen projects. So when I say large scale, I mean in the hundreds of megawatt of electrolyzer capacity. So far, the existing hydrogen projects are typically in the range of a couple of tens of megawatts. There are in China 100 megawatt plus project as well. But we're not yet seeing projects in the size of hundreds of megawatts or gigawatts being installed. There are some in development, some of them have even reached FID. So I think that is something that's going to come in the near future, but it's being delayed a little bit because the offtake has developed slower than originally anticipated. And then obviously if you have large-scale hydrogen generation projects, you also need to think about the infrastructure of how you transport and store that hydrogen, so that will follow up afterwards. And then in the last step, the end use cases, I would say, that are the least developed at this current point, simply because there is no large-scale existing hydrogen infrastructure. So what does that now mean in terms of where is it most promising or exciting or interesting to work at? Well, that really depends on your personal view and your preferences. And I would just in general draw a little visualization that shows us the maturity and level of innovation in all of those sectors. On the left-hand side, we have a rather mature sector, right, that is coupled with a low risk. Of course, every renewable energy development also comes with a certain risk, but the risk is obviously much lower if you're working in a project development company that's focusing on solar power plants, versus, for example, if you work in a fuel cell company that requires all the other market segments to be available until it actually can fully take off, right? So on the right-hand side, we have a higher risk, but also innovation. It's more innovative, right? So it really depends on your personality. Are you someone that is a little bit more risk averse and just wants to work in a place where there's maybe already established processes in the way, where the technology is known and you can just work on, for example, slightly improving it or implementing it into reality? Or are you someone that really likes to work on the cutting edge, on something that hasn't been understood or developed before, and you're going to be the first that really drives that field forward? And you're also willing to take a bit more risk. So then maybe a sector on the right-hand side, 3, 4, or 5 would be very interesting for you. And I would even go further and say, well, that's the sector view, but maybe let's look here on the left-hand side. I've shown you also the different kind of business models that are possible in the renewable energy industry. So you can not only choose between which sector you want to work at, but also, for example, do you want to work in a company that consults in that sector? Do you want to work in a company that does engineering or maybe even EPC or as an EPC contractor? Or do you want to be a project developer that, for example, builds those renewable energy plants or those hydrogen plants or those battery projects? Or do you want to be an OEM that manufactures the equipment, that manufactures batteries, that manufactures electrolyzers or storage vessels or any kind of other equipment? And here there's actually a very similar curve I could draw actually. If we look at, again here, the risk and the level of innovation, it increases obviously the further down you go. When you're in consulting, you have very little risk, right? But you also have limited depth of how much detail you can get into and how much innovation you personally can drive. Because you're consulting other companies, for example, OEMs or project developers, meaning you get to see a lot of different companies, a lot of different projects, and you're getting paid no matter what, right? If the project is going well or not. There's very little risk on the consulting side. And I've done that myself personally. It's, I would say, a very interesting field because you get to look into all the different sectors a little bit. I was working mostly in this area here. And it was exciting because I was working on a project, for example, for 12 weeks on the electrolyzer sector. Then I switched into a battery project for the next 3 months. Then I was looking into storage or even supply chain issues of materials that are needed for those kind of products. So you can get to know a lot of sectors, a lot of problems, a lot of companies very, very quickly, but on a much higher level. So you're not really diving into the actual problems and solving them on a working level basis. So it really depends what kind of person you are. If that's something that's interesting for you to just have a very broad overview of different sectors, then consulting would be great for you. What I've also been doing now for the last 2 years is to work in the project development field. So focusing on this area here, project development, and also the operation of those later projects of a synthetic fuel plant. And the good thing about this is, I would say, is that you can dive very deeply into the actual technology. So that's, for example, electrolyzers and then any power-to-X technologies. But since you also are involved into the sectors before and after you also get a good view in, for example, what kind of storage vessels are available to store my product, right? Who are the end users of my product, because they are potential customers. So you get a good understanding of their products and their segment as well. And you also obviously get an insight into the renewable energy generation, because you need the electricity or the PPAs to generate your carrier molecule or your hydrogen or whatever product you're generating. So, and compared to consulting, you get a much deeper look, I would say, because you are, for example, able to perform technical studies with an OEM that's supplying you battery. You will get a much deeper understanding of that battery and the technical data, the performance, the cost data, than if you're just a high-level consultant. So that's what I personally love about being a project developer. Of course, it comes also with an increased risk, right? Because you need off-takers for your project. And that's not only depending on you and the way you market your product, it's also a lot coupled to regulation. And that's something that's, at least at the current moment in Europe and also in the US right now, very uncertain. And then, of course, you also have an execution risk. And you have a certain risk if, for example, an OEM is not able to deliver on technology. So that, again, then feeds into the execution part of your project. So I would say it's a significantly higher risk than just working as a consultant. And even more so if you would work at an OEM, that's here the last stage, you, on top of all of that, have the risk that maybe you're betting on the wrong technology, right? Let's give an example. If you look at electrolyzers, there's multiple different technologies available. You have alkaline electrolyzers, you have PEM electrolyzers, you have solid oxide electrolyzers, you have AEM electrolyzers. So which one is going to be the winning technology? And even if you bet on the right technology, is your company really the right one that's going to survive? So if we stick to the example of electrolysis, about 2 years ago, everyone thought there's going to be a shortage of electrolyzer capacity. So not enough electrolyzers on the market for all those projects that were coming up. But then offtake actually has been slowing down, as I just mentioned in the beginning. But the electrolyzer vendors, they built up their production capacity because they thought, well, there's going to be offtake for my product. And well, that slowed down, and now we have an overcapacity of electrolyzer manufacturers in the market. So there will be consolidation. So you have the risk, are you betting on the right technology? And also you're in a market where there's an oversupply of capacity. And similar with battery types or also storage types for whatever carrier you're looking at. So risk, again, is increasing, but also if you look at being an OEM, for example, in a battery company or in an electrolyzer company, you're really getting to dive deep into something that's right now being developed. No one has really done that to that degree and on that scale particularly before, right? So of course batteries and electrolyzers exist, but not really on that large industrial scale. And you have the chance also, and that's an opportunity, to become an expert in something in just a few years, because there is no one that has built hundreds of megawatts electrolyzer projects or gigawatt projects or gigawatt battery projects. This just doesn't exist at the moment. So if you're working on that front, you're really able to build experience very, very fast and become an expert in the field. So I would say there's upsides and downsides to each of the segments or sectors, but also each of the business models that you can work in. And I hope this overview just gave you a bit of an impression on what's possible. And if you on top of that have personal questions on which kind of sector or business model would fit to your own personal educational background, your personal preferences, feel free to reach out, send me a comment or an email, and I will also be happy to help you understand where or which play would fit best to you, and also which kind of companies are really the most interesting and best ones in each of those segments. Thanks a lot for listening, and see you in the next video. Cheers!